The speaker of substantial girth so spoke. Men have used sex as a metaphor for the struggle to expand consciousness, and likewise physical labor and exercise. But why, pray telleth, is not the splendid art of eating ever so utilized? And every anxious fat man in the audience leaped to their feet in thunderous applause. Finding. A metaphor don't mean shit if it don't apply to you. Man picked up the unseemly habit of talking to himself through imitation of what his mind does to him. What was that noise? Further stories regarding the great struggle. Once the people were at rest. Then one day they headed toward the castle armed with cauldrons of glue. And the king sent out an emissary to welcome them. They embraced, and all seemed well. Sometime later, a few of the people wanted out of the sticky alliance. But their friends pointed out the safety of remaining aligned with the crown and the dangers of trying to go it alone, even though no one was quite sure what that actually meant. But the few would have it no other way and commenced to struggle for release. Permit me to interrupt the story here and tell you that beyond this point there are several versions leading to an ending. But inasmuch as all of the versions amount to the same thing, I'll skip the superfluity and leave the conclusions in your hands. Oh, okay. A subtropical hint. Have you ever noticed how, in the commonly told adventures, the hero, under the duress of his exploits, never simply abandons the area of stress and misfortune? Hey, kids, care to redefine your concept of a hero? Kids? Kids? Oh, all right, boys and girls, here's an easy one. In the story of, let us say, St. George and the Dragon, do you root for St. George, the dragon, or the guy who thought up the story? The name of the new breakfast food was, the vaguer the metaphor, the better. And as they ate, some men's systems were cleared. Daddy, why do rabbits look at you in darting glances with their heads turned sideways? Now, those are not rabbits, my boy. Those are the more alert, watching their minds. To the same degree that you have a philosophy of life, you have no consciousness. One of the early ways to tell that you're making some progress along the mystical way is that you no longer care if anyone thinks you are a mystic. A man thought, struggling to blow up your own mind has got to be the most thankless task in the universe. Thank God. Daddy, why are there no greeting cards of congratulations or condolences made specifically for mystics? Why, looky there, boy. They've got the leftover Valentine candy on sale at half price. The romance of the mind and something less. While the ordinary fall in love, the extreme wired find that they have fallen into themselves and now want the hell out. Daddy, why you never hear of the more conscious getting divorced? Perhaps because the reality of such a story would prove far too unsettling for common consumption. Daddy, that's right, son. I'm not really talking about matrimony between two people, but about the relationship and its possible dissolution between the few and the mind with which they find themselves bound through a pre-arranged marriage. Daddy, you know why I love so dearly talking with you? Yes, I do, my boy, because I'm all you got. Automotive consciousness here and beyond. Ordinary minds, beige four-door family sedans, the mind of the mystic, an uninsured red convertible with an illegal supercharger. One creation story says that the very first man was doing quite well, thank you, until the second human arrived, and he told them plainly and directly what had happened up until then. And God immediately put a curse on him for not using metaphors and allegories. Comparisons 202. Talk is to reality as reality is to life. Now don't that make you feel better, Mr. Webster? Simple minds or happy minds, as long as they never know how simple they are. Professor, if snails knew of eagles, would they then want to fly? What kind of damn question is that? Well, don't get angry at me. My mind told me to ask it. What kind of damn excuse is that? Simple minds are happy minds, and usually best left at that. There are two ways to handle being on a runaway bus. One is to try and bring the vehicle under control, and the other is to get the hell off. Guess which is easiest? And you're probably wrong, but guess which is the most efficient? By the by, if you let your mind guess for you, your odds of being incorrect increase, shall we say, quite substantially. But that's your business, eh what? Query. Why so commonly do those wishing to increase and clarify their consciousness remove themselves from everyday life and retire to secluded, protected, and quiet places to pursue their goal? At first blush, the answer seems obvious, proper, and practical, but there remains the matter of how people on a bus, apparently not going anywhere they wish to go, will accept their plight, even reassuring themselves that something worthwhile must be taking place just as long as the ride is physically uncomfortable and inconvenient. Query, what need of additional irritation need a mystic save his own mind? You didn't hear that? After a study of all the religions, a man asked himself, why do they all speak of the need for a man to be reborn, and none say how to die, yet live? In the beginning, men called not knowing, not knowing. But then in time, they gave not knowing a name. And ever since then, nothing's been the same. Where the night meets the day, where the sky meets the land, where the shit meets the fan, there does mysticism take up the slack for everything and everybody. The dumber you are, the more you must rely on authority, which is why cowherds have a leader. A young man writes to his foot in your mouth, doctor. Dear doctor, if we metaphorically looked upon the collective consciousness of ordinary man as a kind of homogeneous, homostatic herd, could we not vision the mystic as a type of outlaw stray, a wandering steer without a brand? And the doctor replied, I like you, son. You should come by and see me sometime. Yours truly, the doctor. The lame need crutches, same as ordinary minds need a philosophy to live by. And 3 scientists, 2 atheists, and a shaman stood to object and claim exemption. Thoughts. The danger. A proverb. If you save something, you begin to believe it's important. Spoilage and propriety. A poem. Something thought twice is no longer nice. There was once a man who took a secret mystical school with him everywhere he went. He says he doesn't really deserve any credit for this since he was born with his head already there. More automotive news. Individual thought. Mud tires for the mind. Gourmet consciousness here and beyond. Who decries originality in the kitchen more than a cannibal? A guy told a mystic, I get the impression that you don't much give a damn what people think of you. And when the wired one didn't respond, the guy said, well, aren't you going to tell me what you think about what I said? Philosophies of life. Cliches all swole up. Somebody will pay for that. That'll always get a laugh. Why? because most people's nervous. Well, political consciousness here and beyond. The idea for coup d'etats and palace revolts was taken from observing how mystics treat their minds. The motto of one purported school of enlightenment was, "Don't disturb the simple." And as soon as he saw it, one potential student turned and left, knowing immediately all he needed in regards their limited vision. Neurological consciousness here and now. In the world of the mind, there are two kinds of drugs, those to soothe and those to excite. The few must produce their own unknown pharmaceutical, the one that does everything possible all at the same time. I'm sure I heard that again. Conversation overheard around a transcendental area. I'll be doing both parts, evidently, of the conversation. One way to tell if a person has real promise as regards this sort of thing is to tell them that it doesn't actually exist anywhere other than in their own head, and see if they can immediately comprehend this news. When you say immediately comprehend this news, how soon are we talking about when you tell them this? Well, you can tell them as soon as you meet them if you want to. It sounds like you're leaving something out. Yes, even though you can tell them this from day one, before it usually begins to have any practical significance to them, we're talking generally day 6, 7,000, let's say. Wow. Wow, indeed, if you truly understand the nature of wow. Written on the wall in the mystic's men's room, conversing with civilians is like sliding through life on a Velcro dance floor. Though I won't burden you with a direct quote, under this, someone had noted how this also applies within the ballroom of one's own mind. A statistic. Over 97% of those engaged in consciousness expanding activities are engaged in the activity, not in consciousness expansion. A fact. There are 3 hobbies available to man. The first is simply being alive. The second is believing you're involved in something more complex. And the third is in actually being so involved. A more knowing man would live by but a single consumer byword. Never. Never buy anything that someone is trying to sell you. Further note that such a person would also hold such a position in regards to the things his mind tells him. The dynamics of collective public morality and intelligence. People with a philosophy of life will not only rape your sister, but will afterwards condemn you for being related to such a person. To try and throw the king's trackers off their scent, some of the fleeing mystics began referring to themselves as so-called mystics. For those of you on Armed Forces Radio, if they're all, since the more conscious don't think what anyone else thinks, when they talk about what they think, ordinary minds don't know what to think about it. All right, I will. Since the more conscious don't think what anyone else thinks, when they talk about what they think, ordinary minds don't know what to think about it. Consciousness, a fly. The mind, fly paper. The solution, think like an insect. One unverified history of mysticism says that it all came from the very first mystic who made the whole thing up. Moral and warning. If you personally don't know the secret, you're probably far too easily, shall we say, upset. Double moral, whipped cream, and a cherry on it. The ordinary trust only in things which seem reasonable, factual, real, and true, while those who know don't trust anything. Well, when you know, what's the need for trust? So let me get this straight. You're saying that the whole of mysticism derived from the very first mystic who just made it all up. No, I said according to one unverified history. That wasn't actually here. I had lived that on your behalf. And finally, we close with another in our series of, I beg your pardon, proverbial wisdom corrected. I beg your pardon, but truth is not stranger than fiction. Truth is fiction. There was a news item recently that said that those who know must speak in metaphors, parables, allegories, but metaphors. Because if they talked about those who know the secret, and put it that way, that those who know the secret must speak in metaphors, because if they talked about it plainly and directly, ordinary people would find it too fantastic to ever be believable. Now, the first time that news item was read, if I recall, for some reason several people sort of chuckled like, well, how funny. There are some strange people in the world. You could say that's funny, but it's a lot funnier than you ever imagined. Because at first, anyone who had ever been interested in the kind of history or reading or thinking about supposedly some effort to change one's state of consciousness, sans drugs, apparently doing it through some mystical, metaphysical, secret effort. It always culminates, the known history, it always culminates that if who is writing or telling of their exploits, if they claim to have achieved the condition of enlightenment, etc., if they do not come back and absolutely go bananas or become an author, take your choice, that is, begin to seriously write about it. At least their first explanation, when they come back to a kind of verbally coherent condition, I don't mean that you're incoherent when you're there, but when they slip back close enough to ordinary consciousness, when they realize, well, I'm not going to do myself any damage to talk about it, which is a fact. I'll go ahead and admit that, which is in all the stories you've read, but you could say that when you're in the heart of the great experience, it's almost impossible for anybody to get you to talk about it, for reasons I've already talked about, sideways and obliquely, and other straightforward and direct manners. But those who do attempt to say something afterwards, the best that can be said, the most coherent, the closest to the reality of it, the truthfulness of it is, they say, well, you can't really describe it. And as a rule, they proceed from there to begin to talk about it. And so then you could take my news item, that those who know the secret must speak in metaphors because blah, blah, blah. You could say, well, that's how it came about. Because they did speak in metaphors. If we'd take the stories, all the classic stories of people who reached some state of consciousness wherein they saw life directly, that they liberated consciousness in some way, all those terms. That if they do try to tell someone, anybody, their best friend, the monks hanging around Buddha, those kind of stories, that they would have to speak in metaphors, assuming that the first part that I related to you, that they always attempt to convey, that is, well, I can't really describe it, and their friends say, well, come on, tell me something. They go, okay. And then the archetypical Jesuses, Hindu gods, Buddha, and etc., they began to speak in parables. They said, all right, there was once a man who lived on a kumquat farm, and he had 3 brothers. And people start listening because they know that he's talking about something other than a farmer raising kumquats. And it makes sense if you follow into this, I never thought about before, that, well, that is the nature of metaphor, not in the literary sense, but in the mystical sense. A metaphor and parables are used based upon the fact that you cannot talk about what life is. And then you can go on and weave philosophies ad infinitum after that if you're so inclined. And you just you pile metaphor upon metaphor, allegory upon allegory, and then maybe throw on a parable right on top of the whole pile. And it makes sense to those who think about such things, or if it's pointed out to them, they will accept it that, yes, that is reasonable. And that must be what you were pointing out. No. That is sort of funny enough, because you could chuckle and say, well, boy, I'm just sure that's true. I'm just sure that whatever the enlightenment is and all of being in that kind of state, just surely it's so astounding, I'll take their word for it, that if they're going to try and convey anything, it must be in metaphor. And you can chuckle and smile. But it's doubly funny. It's a lot funnier than that. What if that's not it? That has historically been accepted as it, and for whatever purpose I had in mind, I could take the same position and defend it, shore it up, even embellish it, because it is based upon, God forbid, the reality as seen by ordinary minds, as perceived by ordinary minds. But it is doubly funny if there is any validity to my news item. And you should not question the news. You can question fiction and rumors, but not the news. Time is too short, and this is down near the 20th century. Did we just miss something? Can you spell 100 years? No. I sometimes enjoy people watching tape and may refer to being here in 1964 in Oslo. And then have viewers watching this in Germany or Canada or somewhere and think, what year is this, Helen? Turn to somebody. And plus realize, or they just struck like, I didn't know I could speak Norwegian. The news item, my news item said that those who know the secret, those who have seen it, must speak in metaphor, because if they talked about it plainly and directly, which is already in counter-distinction to what I just said, the historical view, that you can't talk about it. You just, for reasons that you can't know until you see it, you just cannot talk about it, because if you could talk about it, you can rationally, as far as you can do it with this sort of transcendental notion, you can rationally, down there, rationally, prove the point of why metaphor and parable and allegory must be used, because you can say, well, what you see, when your consciousness is freed from that kind of mind level, that kind of gravity of ordinary mind, then what you're seeing can't be everyday affairs that are easily described, because if they were, then you and everyone else would turn around periodically, if not constantly, and go, oh, and you'd just be enlightened and awakened, and all these poor people that went to monasteries and starved themselves and whirled and danced and sat, they would think, Jesus, boy, we got took. And so it almost makes sense that, well, what you see has got to be, if it is out of the ordinary, then it makes absolute rational sense at that new level that it can't be described, because there's no basis for it. Just what you're used to, there is no nomenclature, there is no verbiage, there is no rhetoric. There are words not available to describe what it is, because if we could, then we could describe exactly what it is. People would go, oh. And no one claims that that can be done. So it appears that it must be put in some sort of metaphorical context. But back to my news item. It says that those who know the secret must speak in metaphors, because if they talked about it plainly and directly, and right there we've already got problems, because the classical, the historical version is, and description is, that it cannot be described plainly and directly, which is why it must be put in metaphor and allegory. So me and all, or else all of them are wrong, and we know who's going to win that contest, because I'm here and they're not. It says that if they tried to talk about it plainly and directly, now it gets even funnier, that is my opinion, that if they had tried to talk about it, to tell people about it plainly and directly, see, there's the first joke, that you mean it can be done. If they tried to talk about it plainly and directly, first one, here comes the second one, ordinary minds, if you talk about it plainly and directly, would find it just too fantastic to be in any way believable. It is very close to being antithetical of the original version. That this is insinuating, to say the least, that it could be told directly and plainly. But if it were, now keep in mind simultaneously that we're already talking about the difficulty that everyone has with metaphor and allegory and parable. I mean, you simply do. You're supposed to. It's not a matter of intelligence. If there is, we'll assume for a second, in some objective, imaginary objective way, that somebody presents a metaphor, or you hear a metaphor or a parable, and let's assume that it had a background from someone who knew something, that it had a true transcendental background. It's not a matter of intelligence for me to say that you always have some problem, there's some difficulty, there's some challenge, there's some neural struggle involved with the metaphor, or else it would have no value. What would be the purpose of a metaphor? They would just say whatever it was they were saying. If they were going to say, blessed are the poor, if that was it, they'd say that instead of, there was once a man who owned a kumquat farm and had 3 brothers. And to drag you along for 2 or 3 minutes with this parable, if it was going to amount to, I'm just making this up, of course, if the point of it was, blessed are the poor, then why don't you just say, blessed are the poor? Because if you're going to start, there was once a man with a kumquat farm. Then you got to wonder, what the hell a kumquat farm? And once upon a time, when? And he had 3 brothers. Don't make me make up anymore. You know how parables go, and they get worse and worse. And he decided to shift his crop over to sugar beets. And the first brother said, nay, nay. And the second one got so mad he sat on his amplifier. You know, and you get into stuff like that. And it's got to be some kind of challenge, or else you would just present whatever the damn message was supposed to be directly and plainly. So you have got some sort of, if you're going to make any use of, if we'll assume there is any possible efficacy and value to the said parable, then you have to participate. You have to intellectually get in and dance with it. It's not like a teacher saying, all right, the multiplication tables by rote, everyone go 2 and 2 is 4. You do it. Or you keep repeating something about 30 days have September, April, June in the 18th century. See, we lost something again. Time gets slippery, especially here in Finland. So the metaphor presents some sort of challenge. It has to, perforce, of what it is. Or else whatever was being said would be served out directly. They would just hand over the counter and say, well, here's your cheese sandwich. But a metaphor, it ends up, it looks like some sort of 10-layer wedding cake, and it's wrapped in a box, and it's inside the trunk of a Volkswagen. And you have to, you go in and you say, is this a place to get something to eat? And they say yes, and they stick this, Volkswagen Beetle up on the counter, and you got to in some way get the whole thing unraveled, look here and there in glove compartments, and you finally get down somewhere in there as a cheese sandwich. But you think, well, if I came in here, you walk in and say, is it a place to get something to eat? And the guy, the baker behind the counter goes, yes. And you go, cheese sandwich? Or something that you recommend. He says, how about a nice cheese sandwich? And you think, well, if you recommend it, I'll accept it. And he puts his Volkswagen Beetle up there. If you knew that the end result, if what he had in mind for your nutritional needs was a cheese sandwich, and if he had already insinuated it's in there somewhere, if you knew what it was to begin with, if you knew it was going to be something as simple and direct as a cheese sandwich, why didn't he just hand you the damn cheese sandwich? I knew that would help. There's nothing like taking metaphors and then take other metaphors to explain them. No, that's easy. And take the new metaphor that you're using as an explanatory device and turn it inside out and stuff the original in it. It's known in the Greek Navy as hide the pickle, but we won't go into that. No, that's something else. I'm sorry. See, how many countries will be writing in this one? The metaphor is assumed by any reasonable person who's interested in such matters that the metaphor is used for the reason. Once it's described to them, if you've never thought about it, using your generic list, the person hadn't thought about it, if you say, well, it's for the point because there are some things that cannot be directly said, and therefore they have to be put in a parable. Now, that's been noted just by ordinary linguistic experts and literary observers and critics. I mean, that's nothing new. They're assuming Even if they're not interested, they will assume, like the parables in the New Testament, that Jesus was trying to say something about other than what it sounded like. Or that when the prophets, the old prophets, or the prophets of the Old Testament were talking about all the stuff of ladders running to the sky and wheels in the air and all that, that they weren't talking about. That was something else. Even if you don't believe, if you're not Jewish or Christian or even interested, people go, well, yeah. You know, assuming they were saying, they obviously had something else in mind. So you're assuming that, or if it's pointed out to you, and you're interested in such matters, if it's pointed out that the reason parables, metaphors, symbolism, allegory are used is because there's some things that cannot be said directly. It only took you 25 minutes to get all that out. Well, hey, 2,500 years, most people don't understand it. So if that be true, and I can speak for everyone who is interested in such as this, I can, without running any error, everyone who is interested in such as this, at some time, or at least when I point out now, goes yes. That is obviously what even the recorded life of some of these supposed mystics is. You can take the so-called history or life of a Moses or Zoroaster or Confucius. Wow, you can take his life itself, the history of it, and take it as a metaphor. Or that Jesus, he didn't go through all these trials, he wasn't going out tempted by bad spirits, that all of this happened inside one man, and this whole thing about him traveling around and trying to upset the religion of his day and being tried by the people and being found to be an upsetting influence, in fact a political rebel, worthy of destruction by the state. Forget all that. It's not even important. It's only children that then get involved. Wait a minute. How much historical, archaeological evidence do we have that blank existed? Jesus or Moses. It's just another hobby for them. It is a metaphor, whether they exist or not, for what took place with the mystical struggle in one man. So, back to where the setup for the rest of the joke. I mean the setup for the rest of my comments for the night. That it is obvious then, if you give any valid credence to ideas of higher kinds or different kinds of knowledge, different states of consciousness, the whole thing that this is involved with. If you give any value, any credit to it being based upon something real, then you immediately will take all of the literature, if it's pointed out, take all of the literature, the history of the so-called great mystical work and activity as being in some way metaphorical, and for one reason, that a Buddha, a Jesus, a Muhammad, someone who had the experience, someone not an accident, someone who actually worked at it and achieved whatever it is mystics are up to, and decided for whatever reason to try and say something about it. They try and say something about it, and I point out to you that all of the literature, all the history, all of it, if it has any validity at all, if it's based upon what actually occurred in one man, one man's understanding, no matter how far away and far removed, then what is said now, including the history of him, is a metaphor for the simple reason that what he saw, what he understood, could not be put in simple, direct words, or if it could, he would have been awake years ago. He'd have been enlightened, and we all would, because he would just say, oh, there's just this little thing that it took me all these years, maybe I was stupid, but I was working on it, and I finally saw what it is, and here it is. And he would tell us, and we'd all go, well, I'll just be goddamn. And that'd be it. He'd be like somebody suddenly showing you how to actually get the lint out of your dryer so that your clothes don't keep catching on fire. And they say, well, you reach down, you pull that out, and you throw it away. And your whole life has changed, so to speak. There's only so many meaningful examples a man can come up with. No, there's not, but I just said that. So you wouldn't think that you certainly did find a great deal of metaphorical significance in Lent. If you press that, that can be upsetting to certain aspects of your so-called higher part of your neural system, but I'll leave that to you. So it can be easily established a person is not seeing it in a distorted manner, to accept the fact that all of the mystical literature, including the histories of the mystics, can be seen metaphorically for the reason that what the people saw, what they did, cannot be directly described. As I said, even in a metaphysical sense, it makes rhetorical sense. It is linguistically logical. That if you buy the first part, it just seems, well, they've got to. There's no other reason that men would speak in metaphors that understand something out of the ordinary that they're trying to say. Assume again that they're sane, they don't have any trick in mind, that they're giving it their best shot, then the reason that they say, all right, there was once a man who owned a kumquat farm. It is simply because what it is he wants to say, you can't say directly. What if that be wrong? Nothing can actually be wrong, but what if that be wrong? What if that be not as right as it could be? What if that not be right as it could be if you had more than 2 ears and they were in the condition that yours are in? What if my news item is more right? Now I'll have English teachers writing. All right, more writer. Bring us really up to date for the American school system. My news item is more writer. Those who know the secret must speak in metaphor, because if they told what they know, if they talked about what they know plainly and directly, ordinary minds would find it too fantastic to even give it any hearing. I don't see any increase in the volume or amount of laughter here. What if what life's about, the so-called secret of what people, the Enlightenment reveals, etc. But I like mine's as good as any. Knowing the secret. For years and years, if you want real history, it was in greater popularity, the idea that, back with the Egyptians and the Greeks, it's not important, but everything goes in fads, short skirts, long skirts, and for a while it was that before Buddha's, at least in the West, of it being translated, the idea of an enlightenment was that there were some people who knew the secret. And that's probably one of the oldest descriptions of it, that the Egyptian, the idea of royalty, which a lot of this historically now is looked at politically, but I would suggest to you that in many cases it was the idea of a royalty or a crown, and many times you notice I use kings in a story, and you know damn well, but now it has nothing to do with politics. But at any rate, that the king or whoever seemed to be the authoritative figure in a culture somewhere, some group of people, was someone who knew a secret. In the West, the mystical, this kind of activity for a long time was just known as the mysteries. That the Greeks even, that was not an uncommon term. You didn't have to be involved in some monastery. It was just known that many of the plays they were just presented as being a metaphorical representation of the mysteries. And the mysteries were just known to certain people as the gods that selected or that found the right kind of drug and could kind of put you in touch with it. Scratch that last part. If that worked, it'd be the same thing as blessed are the poor. That brings some of the stories according to how much you'd like to pay for cheap, unusable proverbial wisdom. Well, you compare what it would take to believe an impotent piece of proverbial wisdom like blessed are the poor, figure out what that cost you to pursue that over a long length of time, as opposed to just buying some cocaine or some LSD. Back to the track. So you already lost your place. At any rate, I was just defending or pointing out, I may call it know the secret. I know it doesn't sound like the great liberation, all in capital letters, or the great awakening, or the enlightenment. But it was known for years as simply the mysteries, that there were people who specialized, or the guides had selected, people here and there, the shamans, the priests who ran the temples, and at least in the western part of the world, in Egypt and Greece, and it was just simply accepted that they're mysteries, and there's some people who know them, the rest of us don't. And sometimes the gods, or these shamans and these priests, they would come out and they would make some comment. One of the most famous is the one that supposedly spoke to Socrates and says, know thyself. According to Socrates' version, or Plato's version, not Socrates, anyway, that changed his whole life, that was his guiding beacon, that was the piece of direct information. That was some sort of metaphorical representation of the mystery that the priest or priestess knew. At any rate, knowing that there were mysteries in life, and that there were some people, in some way, usually the guides, that's why I said strike the drug thing, that in some way just some people knew them. And that still has some currency throughout the world now. Normally, I guess still referred to as shamans in most places, that your father was a witch doctor, your father was the shaman of a tribe, and in some way it seems generally to get passed along, and that you hear voices, you see spirits, you can try and reveal some of the mysteries of life. So there were people, it was accepted that there was a mystery or a secret. And of course the obvious one, people generally ask, what's going to happen when you die? And if they ever get over that, they might say, why are we here anyway? They'll think about that a little while, and then most people go, well, never mind that. If you're going to give me an answer to one of the two, I don't know what happens when I die. And the great version, the great civilized version of that, how come good, honest, decent, intelligent, fairly good-looking people like me aren't rich, and all these bad people are? That's to try to distract you from the fact that you're both going to die. Well, wait a minute, I didn't what I asked. The mysteries. I was calling it knowing the secret. That it is not an unwarranted description. So back to my news item. Those who know the secret, those who have seen what life is about, not reality, no opinion, no description, no criticism, the enlightenment as witnessed by my other description, the experience known as, oh, that seemed to be more socially acceptable for years I used. Well, I'll be goddamned. And some people, that seem to throw them off their feed. Now I realize, what the hell am I trying to do waking up horses anyway? But those who know the secret must speak a metaphor, because if they tried to tell what they know plainly and directly, ordinary minds would find it far too fantastic to be worthy of any belief. After all this time, does anyone see that that is flat-ass backwards and in contradiction to every known mystical, even academic views of the history of mysticism about why mysticism and religion, all the prophets, speak in parables? That even if you don't agree with it, the historians involved with religion and literature, everyone agrees, there's no doubt that people were spoken parables. Certain people throughout history, certain very famous people. And they spoke in parables, and it's just accepted even if the historian. And I'm trying to show you that minds who are disinterested, people, minds who are not actually, who believe themselves involved, will still defend the position, accept the position that even if they don't claim to understand what a Jesus or Buddha or Moses was talking about, they say, well, it's obvious that he was talking about something else. There's no doubt he is speaking in a parable, in a metaphor. I don't know what it was, but it seems to have an effect on people. If you buy the whole the description that it must be done because there are things that cannot be said, you do realize that my news item says that they could be said. I just kind of slipped it in. It just says that if they did try, they must be a metaphor, because if they did talk about these secret plainly and directly, nobody'd believe it. Do you see where we are? I say that hopefully and rhetorically. If you're anywhere within spitting or hearing distance after all this time, do you realize where this brings us? Instead of the fact, perhaps I should be a little cruder and blunter about it, you do realize this, take this into account, that parables, what I was trying to get you to see, offer some sort of challenge. In other words, parables, in many cases, are too fantastic. I'm using fantastic in a wide sense, that parables, someone who can listen, if they were told that, someone who was not a Christian, let's say, and they were told, if you'll study the parables of Jesus, it has some, forget the religion, it has some sort of psychological, metaphorical intent within the parables that he spoke about that had nothing to do with religion. It might have to do with one's own attempt to mature oneself, to evolve one's own consciousness. And it's got nothing to do with life after death or worshiping gods. If you took that somebody that, of some authority, someone you respect, and you went, all right, I'll think about it. In many cases, you think about it, or it's always happened, and people say, well, that's too fantastic. I mean, sure, it may be a metaphor, but when they start about, and the Spirit of God, the Spirit of the universe came upon a man, and it starts talking about this and that, or people wrestling angels, or people talking to gods, and those who are not wired up, and who were not born into that, they'll go, it's just too fantastic. That you cannot even, many people cannot even get into any possible consideration that there could be psychological, let's say, commentaries, intentions having to do with a man's individual effort inside these parables. because the parables seem too fantastic. The idea that, all right, Jesus, I keep using the ones you know about, but you know the stories of trail of the world. A prophet supposedly trying to upset people's consciousness, and the state kills him. Life itself, reality kills him. But he comes back to life. Now, of course, you grew up around that, whether you believe it or whether you're a Christian or whatnot. But the thing is, if you were hearing that for the first time, if somebody insisted, hey, if you go approach this religion or this particular mystical teaching, there is a great, what the kind of stuff you're interested in is in there. I mean, all kinds of practical information. And you start reading about it and you find out that the heart of, let's say, Christianity is you've got to believe that this man died. The guy was out there human, he would bleed, he would sweat, he could sleep, he ate, and that they killed him. But he came back to life. Now, if you heard that for the first time, try and imagine, you can do that, and then you were just an ordinary person. Don't ask me how you could get to be an ordinary, sophisticated person, not have ever heard such stories, but when you first heard it, and somebody told you that there's something in there, you go, wait a minute, there might be, but Jesus, I can't, pardon the expression, but Muhammad, but I cannot get past that. It's too fantastic. I mean, if people believe that, and the mind says it's too fantastic, I can't go any further. Understand. I'm slipping up, I'm laying it brick by brick. Non-union, but so you can get through in a hurry. Plus I can water down the mud. Well, it's not going to hold together anyway. Oh, it might. I mean, you might want to, but you know me. Here it is, we got more or less 10 minutes, and at least in 9 minutes and 30 seconds from now, I'm going to tear it down. So it's up to you if you try to go away and think, yes, it's still standing. I covered that tonight if you weren't listening. It was Thoughts, was the title. Thoughts, the danger, a proverb. If you save something, you'll start thinking it's important. I said a proverb. Should I say a metaphor? No. You ever see these things that they'll do a human interest little sidebar, a little feature on the news? Man out somewhere outside of Omaha has a ball of twine the size of a Rolls Royce. He's been working. I mean, it's so big, and they go out there and they film it. And he stands there and he spits, and they ask him, like, what does your wife think? Well, she threw me out of the house, and we had to tear down the garage. We had to get rid of the car and one of our tractors because the damn ball of twine takes up everything. And so they said, I guess some of your friends think you're kind of nutty. And they said, yeah, in the beginning, people thought it was funny. And so, well, you ever thought about getting rid of it? I mean, it's the largest in the world. You're in the Guinness Book. And suddenly you see the man go, oh, no. Now, they don't make anything about it. The news reporters, they're there for just a little light story and fill in the last 30 seconds of a short news broadcast. But when we no need to laugh at a Midwestern farmer, because I'll bet you some of you people got books at home, little manuscripts that track you saved, certain clothes, records, all kinds, but things, and you keep saving like one thing that you don't use. But you think, I cannot throw this away. There is some, of course, some basis for the nesting instinct at the survival level. But then if you believe everything natural is necessary, we've already been through that. But at any rate, just notice, I'm sure everyone's got one or two little things at home that you never use, but every time you run across it, there's no doubt. I mean, there's no question. You're not about to throw it away. You see it, and you know that you hadn't looked at it or used it in years, but there's no possibility you're going to throw it away. And what's happened is, in my fresh proverb, except remember, I didn't talk about records or anything. I leave it at what it was right up front. I gave you time to be distracted because I read the title out real disjointedly, if you recall. I'll do it again. Thoughts. The danger. A metaphor. If you save something, you'll start thinking it's important. Now we're on to the next one. Whatever it is you're saving, and you look at it, there's no question, no possibility you'll throw it away, you put it back up. Do you realize you don't sit there and think about it, but now that thing has some importance. And whatever it is you're picturing, looking chagrined, as you should, that if somebody suddenly jumped out, a reasonable person, Einstein, your mother-in-law, the next door neighbor, says, every time you clean house, I see you pick up that thing and go and secrete it somewhere and hide it and put it back together, and you never use it. You go, yeah. And they say, well, why don't you throw the damn thing away? And you don't know how to explain it, but it's important. It's become important if somebody tried to explain to you, and you're, as they say, your rational mind. See, even the ordinary world has a sense of humor, because they coined that term, the rational mind. I keep running across that. Well, some of you think that the ordinary world doesn't have a sense of humor, or life doesn't. That if someone tried to get you, and they said, well, explain to me what value this has. It has no intrinsic value. That if you threw it out in the street right now, the garbage man wouldn't even take it home. You understand? But to you don't even think about it anymore. It's just every time you clean house or something, you put it back away. Without you realizing it, you have fallen into being a poster boy for my proverb. If you save something, you begin to think it's important. That was followed by the next page very quickly that said, spoilage and propriety, a poem. That things thought twice are no longer nice. Which by spoilage, you understand, I was trying to insinuate that things thought twice is like a pork chop left out in the sun overnight, if that was possible. Out on the back porch over the weekend, who but an idiot would try to eat it? But thinking the same thing twice? Whoa. But then I also defined for you philosophies of life. Cliches all swole up. Here we go. The wall looking good and sturdy. Killed enough time to sneak back up on the wall. All parables, all metaphors seem to offer do offer some challenge. They are not direct by their very nature, by the definition of what a metaphor is. It's saying one thing and meaning something else, including symbolism, allegories, parables. It is saying one thing while meaning, perhaps literally, what it's saying may make sense, and you may go, oh, but the intent is something other than the literal meaning of it. So therefore, if that be true, and there be anything to it, then it takes some effort. There is some challenge on your part, but consider, I just used one example of Jesus coming from the dead. Think about all the things you've read of mystics. It can be outside religion, the idea that there are men living in the mountains of Tibet who are 300 years old. They weigh 50 pounds. They go around nude and they sit in the snow for months at a time and do not move. And there are people who are just absolutely fascinated by that. In case you'd like to think why. I'll give you the reason why they think we don't die. Very, very weak people like those stories. Weak in two parts of the body. But the point is, all metaphors are in some way fantastic. It's just according to whether you grew up around it and you're used to one or two of the others, that they become habitual thought to you. But all metaphors, parables, and allegories, if they have any meat on them, if they have any nourishment, they are fantastic to start with. Now back to my news item. So, it's generally considered, and you would generally agree up until tonight, that metaphors are used if they're being used properly and with some validity to them, some extraordinary validity and possibility to them. They're used for one reason only, that what the person's trying to say can't be described, and so therefore they must couch it in some kind of allegorical terms and try to make something that makes almost some sense. And the news item is saying, in an offhand, indirect way, just the opposite. That that's not why they're used. That's not why fantastic, mythical metaphors about kings and dragons and life after death and flying through the air and overcoming age and sickness, things that just verge on being too fantastic to believe until your mind goes, well, but they're allegorical now. So that's the reason. What if it's not? What if it is, God forbid I should say it, damn near the opposite? That if a Buddha, if someone who knew the secret said, all right, I'm going to tell you what it is, and they told you. Ordinary minds, we won't say you, ordinary, sane, people who just show some interest in this. I'm not excluding you. I'm just saying I don't mean it directly at you. What the news item is saying, if you heard it, on your best day, I'll go ahead and say it, unless you know it yourself, on your best day, even if you thought, if you heard it, whoever you heard it from, if you thought, that guy, I trust him more than anybody, and I just know he knows, and if he told you, you know what I'm trying to represent by my theatrics? You wouldn't know how to put it, but you know what you would be wanting after that? Well, one thing you'd want, you'd be saying, well, tell me something else, because it'd be pretty short and sweet. I'm going to have to tell you the truth. It wouldn't be as long as, there was once a man who owned a kumquat farm and had 3 brothers. One of these things that takes, a paragraph in a holy book or any book. I'll tell you this much. It would be considerably shorter than that. So if he told you, and he said, all right, I'm going to tell you directly. I'm just going to tell you just plain and direct as far as the language. Well, no excuses. He doesn't condition and say, well, this is taking consideration the limits. If he just said, all right, I'm going to tell you. I'm going to tell you exactly what the secret is. I'm going to tell you what people see in the enlightenment. When the consciousness is liberated from the comments and the whole of the mind. And he went, no, and he told you. I can drag this out, but you'd bend over through some kind of body language or something, and you'd go, and if he didn't play along, you'd say, well, God, I appreciate that. I mean, I'll be studying that, I'm sure, for years to come. But, and the but is like, well, tell me something else. And you know what you're actually saying without knowing it? You're saying, could you turn that into a metaphor? And you know why? You couldn't say this either. It would be, you wouldn't say, I don't believe that. It would just be, you were just sure that when he said, I'm going to tell you pointly, just directly and plainly, you would hear it, and it would be so fantastic, you would just be sure that's a metaphor, except he didn't tell you it was a metaphor, so you assume it's some sort of trick, and you go, well, God, I'm going to write that down. I'll probably have it tattooed because he told you that was going to be it. And you go, oh, that's so great. But, could you tell me a little bit more? Yeah. And you know what you're saying? You're saying, that's too fantastic to believe. Couldn't you tell me something? Mm-hmm. And what he'd be left with, he'd go, well, all right. There's a guy who had a kumquat farm. And you'd think, oh, now we're getting somewhere.